Welcome to SR Bedtime Stories. Tonight, we are taking a quiet train journey through America in the year 1920. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe to SR Bedtime Stories. Now, make yourself comfortable, close your eyes, and let our journey begin. It was the year 1920, and at a small railway station somewhere in America, 9 o'clock had just passed. There were only a few passengers on the platform. Among them was a 32-year-old man named Samuel Carter. He carried a small leather suitcase. That night, he was traveling to a distant town. He believed it would be an ordinary journey. But he knew nothing about the people he was about to meet on that train. Samuel walked to a wooden bench near the end of the platform and sat down. He placed his small suitcase beside him and took his train ticket from his coat pocket. The name of his destination was clearly printed on it. A letter he had received a few days earlier was the reason for this journey. That letter was still inside his suitcase. Samuel had not spoken to anyone about the letter. A few words in it had left him with many questions. But if he wanted to find the answers, he had no other choice but to make this journey. The station clock showed 20 minutes past 9. Just then, he heard the distant sound of a train. The sound of the train slowly grew louder. The passengers on the platform picked up their luggage and moved closer. Samuel picked up his suitcase as well. A few moments later, a large steam locomotive entered the station, followed by a line of passenger coaches. The train slowly came to a stop beside the platform where Samuel was waiting. The coach door opened. Samuel checked his ticket once more and stepped inside the correct coach. There were wooden seats, overhead luggage racks, and small reading lamps. He chose a seat beside the window. After placing his suitcase on the rack above him, he sat down quietly. The train was still at the station. There were not many passengers in the coach. An elderly man was sitting alone across from Samuel. He appeared to be about 68 years old. He wore a gray three-piece suit, a white shirt, a black tie, and a black hat. An old brown leather bag rested beside him. The old man looked at Samuel and gave him a small smile. "Long journey?" the elderly man asked. Samuel looked at him and smiled slightly. "Maybe," he replied. The old man slowly nodded. That was all. After that, they both sat quietly again. Samuel looked through the window, while the elderly man rested one hand on his old leather bag and waited calmly for the train to leave. A few minutes later, the coach door opened. The conductor stepped inside and began checking the passengers' tickets one by one. Samuel took his ticket from his coat pocket and handed it to him. The conductor looked at it carefully and returned it. Then he walked over to the elderly passenger. The old man reached into his coat pocket for his ticket. The elderly man handed his ticket to the conductor. The conductor checked it, nodded, and continued down the coach. Outside, the station clock showed 25 minutes past 9. The conductor reached the end of the coach. A moment later, a long whistle sounded. The train slowly began to move. Samuel turned toward the window and looked outside. The train moved farther away from the station. Samuel sat quietly, looking through the window. After a few minutes, even the last lights of the station disappeared from view. His destination was still many miles away. While Samuel remained lost in his thoughts, the elderly man across from him slowly began opening his old leather bag. The elderly man took a small, old envelope from among the things inside his bag. Its edges were worn from years of age. He held it gently in both hands and looked at it quietly for a moment. Samuel turned from the window and glanced toward him. The old man noticed his look, but said nothing at first. Samuel glanced at the envelope again. The old man noticed and quietly said, "It's a very old letter." Samuel said nothing. Turning the envelope gently in his hands, the elderly man added, "I've kept it for 20 years." Samuel looked at him. For the first time, he found himself wondering why the old man had kept that letter for so many years. The old man did not answer right away. For a moment, he looked quietly through the window as the train continued through the night. At last, holding the envelope carefully in his hands, he said, "Some letters are not meant only to be read." Samuel looked at him. The old man gave a faint smile and added, "Sometimes, they take us back to a place." Those words made Samuel even more curious. "Where are you going?" he asked. The old man looked at him for a moment before answering. Then he gave a faint smile. "That is the thing," he said. "I am going back there for the first time in 20 years." Samuel listened more carefully. The old man opened the aged envelope again. From inside, he carefully took out a small black and white photograph. Its edges were worn from many years of age. He looked at it quietly for a few moments, then held it out toward Samuel. "Take a look," he said softly. Samuel carefully accepted the photograph. Samuel carefully studied the photograph. It showed a young man who looked about 20 years old, standing beside a young woman. Behind them was a small American town from around the year 1900. Samuel looked closer at the photograph. The resemblance between the young man and the elderly passenger was unmistakable. The old man pointed to the young man in the photograph. "That was me," he said. Samuel looked at the photograph again. Now the resemblance between the young man and the elderly passenger was unmistakable. But Samuel's attention soon shifted to the young woman standing beside him. For the first time, he strongly wondered who she was. Samuel was about to ask about the young woman, but he stopped when he noticed the sudden change in the old man's expression. The elderly man took the photograph back and looked at it silently for a moment. Finally, he spoke very softly. "Her name was Margaret." Samuel said nothing and simply listened. The old man carefully placed the photograph back inside the aged envelope. He put the envelope into his leather bag and closed it. For a moment, his hands remained resting on the bag. "I haven't spoken about her to anyone in many years," he said quietly. Samuel did not answer. The train continued its journey through the darkness. Samuel remained quiet for a while. The old man's words kept returning to his thoughts. Finally, he asked softly, "Are you going back to the place where she was?" The elderly man did not answer immediately. He kept his hands on the leather bag and looked into the darkness outside the window. Somehow, that silence felt like an answer to Samuel. After a few moments, the old man slowly nodded. "Yes. I'm going back to the same town," he said calmly. "But I'm not going there to meet her." Samuel looked at him in quiet surprise. The old man gave a gentle smile and added, "The rest of the story is a little longer." The old man slowly unfolded the paper. It was an old railway station map. Samuel leaned forward to read the name printed on it. There was a small mark on the map near the town where their train was heading. The old man pointed to the mark and said, "This is where I saw her for the last time." Samuel studied the map for another moment. "Why are you going back there after 20 years?" he asked. The old man slowly folded the map and replied, "Because there is something I never finished there." Samuel said nothing. His curiosity grew stronger as he wondered what the old man had left unfinished. The old man folded the map and placed it inside his coat pocket. For a moment, they both sat quietly. Then he looked at the small table between them and said, "If I tell you about that unfinished matter, you may remember this journey for a long time." Samuel smiled and replied, "I'm listening." The old man paused for a moment, then began his story. 20 years ago, the old man began, I worked in a small shop in the same town this train is heading toward. I was only 22 then. Every morning, before opening the shop, I would walk to the railway station. That was where I first saw Margaret. At first, I thought she was simply another passenger I happened to see at the station, the old man continued. She came there almost every morning at the same time. One morning, a book she was carrying slipped from her hands and fell to the ground. I picked it up and handed it back to her. She smiled and said, "Thank you." It was such a small moment, but that was how we first became acquainted. After that day, Margaret began noticing him at the station every morning. They did not talk much at first, but small conversations slowly began. She told him about her travels, and he spoke about the little shop where he worked. Within a few weeks, seeing each other at the station had become a normal part of their mornings. But one morning, everything seemed different. Margaret arrived at the station, but this time she was not alone. A young man was walking beside her. He seemed to know Margaret very well. The young man watched them from a distance and suddenly felt that there was a story about Margaret that he knew nothing about. After the young man walked away, Margaret remained on the platform for a moment. The young man who had been watching her wondered whether he should approach her. Finally, Margaret noticed him and smiled. "You are very quiet today," she said. He did not ask anything. But the question of who that young man was remained in his mind. A few minutes later, her train arrived, and Margaret stepped aboard. Even after the train left, he remained standing on the platform, watching the empty tracks. The next morning, Margaret returned to the station. This time, she was alone. He wanted to ask her about what had happened the previous day, but Margaret walked toward him first. "You wanted to ask me something yesterday, didn't you?" she said. After a brief pause, he finally asked, "Who was the man you came with?" Margaret looked at him and smiled slightly. "There is something you should know about him," she said. Margaret remained quiet for a moment. Then she gently said, "His name is Edward. He is my brother." The suspicion on the young man's face immediately disappeared. Margaret smiled and said, "I think you may have misunderstood yesterday." He gave an embarrassed smile. "It was nothing," he replied. Margaret looked at him and asked, "Then why were you waiting for me this morning?" Margaret remained quiet for a moment before saying, "Edward is not only my brother. He came to this town to do something important for me." The young man looked at her with surprise. "What kind of thing?" he asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. The sound of an arriving train came from the other side of the station, and she glanced toward it. Then she quietly said, "I cannot tell you yet. But one day, you will know the whole truth." The train arrived at the platform and came to a stop. Margaret picked up her small handbag. Before leaving, she handed the young man the book she had been carrying. "Keep this for me. I will take it back when I return," she said. He accepted it with surprise. "When will you come back?" he asked. Margaret only smiled without answering. As the train began to move, she stood beside the window and looked back at him. After the train disappeared from the station, he remained standing on the platform with the book Margaret had given him. He was curious to open it. but he felt that it was not his place to read someone else's book. When he looked at the first page, however, he noticed Margaret's name written neatly inside. He smiled as he looked at it. From that day on, he decided to keep the book safe until she returned. He had no idea that the little book would eventually become an important part of his life. Even when the shop was closing that evening, the book was still in his pocket. He tried to concentrate on his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the station. He had no idea when Margaret would come back. When she did not appear the following morning either, he realized that he had been waiting for her more than he had expected. At the same time, another question began to trouble him. Why had Margaret written her name inside that particular book? The next afternoon, when the shop was quiet, he finally took the book out of his pocket. He looked at the first page again. Beneath Margaret's name, he noticed a small date. It was not from the previous day. The date was almost 6 months old. He was surprised. That meant the book had been with Margaret for a long time. As he stared at the date, he began to wonder for the first time if there was something about the book that Margaret had never told him. After seeing the date, he closed the book. He wanted to ask Margaret about it directly, but he had no idea when she would return. That same evening, a customer came into the shop looking for some old newspapers. While arranging the papers, a particular article caught his attention. It said that a family from the same town had suddenly left almost 6 months earlier. When he saw the name of that family, his hands suddenly stopped moving. He read the newspaper article carefully once again. The family name printed in the article was the same as Margaret's family name. A sudden concern came over him. The article did not explain why the family had left the town. He folded the newspaper and placed it beside him, then looked at the book Margaret had given him. Why had she written her name in it 6 months earlier? And could the family's sudden departure have something to do with the book? For the first time, he knew he needed an answer. Before closing the shop that night, he read the newspaper article one more time. The date when the family had left the town was very close to the date written inside Margaret's book. This time, he felt certain that the book was not an ordinary book. He carefully placed it inside the inner pocket of his coat. The next morning, he decided to go to the railway station and wait for Margaret. If she returned, he would finally ask her about everything that had been troubling him. The next morning, he reached the railway station before sunrise. The platform was almost empty. The book Margaret had given him was still inside his coat pocket. He waited and kept looking toward the station clock. After a while, the sound of an approaching train reached the platform. His heart began beating faster as the train came closer. But when the train stopped, Margaret was nowhere among the passengers who stepped down. Instead, Edward was the only familiar person who appeared on the platform. Edward stopped as soon as he saw him on the platform. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Edward walked closer and asked, "Are you waiting for Margaret?" He was surprised by the question. "Yes. I thought she would come today," he replied. Edward lowered his eyes for a moment. Then he quietly said, "She did not come on this train. In fact, she was never supposed to come today." Edward led him to an empty bench beside the station. "There are some things you don't know about Margaret," he said quietly. "A lot changed in our family after the last day you saw her." He listened without saying a word. Edward reached into his coat pocket and placed a small folded paper in his hand. "Margaret told me to give this to you," he said. As he looked at the paper, only one question came to his mind. When had Margaret given it to Edward? He slowly unfolded the paper. Inside was a short message written in Margaret's handwriting. If this letter has reached you, it means I could not return when I planned to. But please do not try to find me. When the right time comes, I will tell you everything. After reading the final line, he remained silent for a moment. Edward simply watched his face, waiting for his reaction. Edward remained silent for a moment. Then he said, "She had already decided that you should receive this letter." The young man looked at him in surprise. "Then where did she go?" he asked. Edward did not answer immediately. He looked toward the station clock and quietly said, "There is only one thing I know. She did not leave alone." The words left the young man with a new question. Who had left with Margaret? Edward did not answer the question immediately. He stood up from the bench and walked toward the far end of the platform. The young man followed him. When they reached the end of the platform, Edward took another small envelope from inside his coat. "Margaret gave this to me. But she never told me when I should give it to you," he said. The young man reached for the envelope. Edward did not hand it over yet. Instead, he said, "There is something you need to know first." Edward remained silent for a moment before saying, "Before Margaret left, she told me something. If you truly wanted to know the truth about her, she wanted you to remember one thing before opening this envelope." The young man looked at him with curiosity. "What is it?" he asked. Edward finally placed the envelope in his hand and said, "Not everything she told you may be true, but she had a reason for not telling you everything." The young man looked down at the envelope and slowly began breaking its seal. The young man carefully opened the envelope. Inside, he found a small railway ticket and a piece of paper with an address written on it. As soon as he saw the address, he looked at Edward. It was the name of a small village far from their town. "Did Margaret go there?" he asked. Edward slowly nodded. "I do not know that for certain either. But the last place she ever mentioned was that village," he said. The young man held the railway ticket tightly in his hand. He read the address once again. It was a village he had never heard of. Edward told him that the next train going there would not leave until the following morning. "Then I will go tomorrow," he said firmly. Edward looked at him for a moment. "If you have decided to go, I will not stop you. But first, think about why Margaret gave you this address," he said. The young man did not answer. Looking at the ticket in his hand, he realized for the first time that his journey had truly begun. That night, he could hardly sleep. Before morning, he packed a few things into a small travel bag. He carefully kept Margaret's book, the paper with the address, and the railway ticket with him. Before leaving, he locked the shop and looked back at it one last time. Only then did he fully realize that he was leaving his ordinary life behind and heading toward a village he had never seen before. When he reached the station that morning, the train was already waiting at the platform. Holding his ticket and carrying his small travel bag, he climbed into the carriage. He found an empty seat beside a window and sat down. The train still had a few minutes before departure. Then an elderly man sitting opposite him looked at his travel bag and asked, "Going somewhere far?" He smiled and replied, "Yes. I am going to look for someone." The elderly man smiled at his answer. "If you are boarding a train to look for someone, that person must be very important to you," he said. After a moment, the young man replied, "Yes. But I am not even sure why I need to find her." The elderly man looked out through the window and said, "Sometimes we think we are searching for a person. But once the journey begins, we discover that we are searching for a story we never knew." His words stayed in the young man's mind. After a while, the elderly man took a small old notebook from his coat pocket. "I made a journey like this many years ago," he said. The young man looked at him with interest. "To find someone?" he asked. The elderly man gave a small smile. "Yes. But I never found the person I was looking for. Instead, a stranger I met during that journey changed my life." The young man listened quietly, looking at the old notebook in the man's hands. The elderly man opened his notebook and looked through a few old pages. "I never found the person I was searching for. But in every town I visited, someone told me something new about her," he said. The young man listened carefully. The elderly man glanced at the railway ticket in his hand and continued, "You are searching for someone too. Do not make your decisions too quickly. At every station you visit, listen carefully to the people you meet. Sometimes the answer we are looking for is with someone we never expected." As the train continued slowly along the tracks, the elderly man closed his notebook and put it back into his coat pocket. After a short while, he shared one more thing about his journey. "I had to travel through 3 towns before I discovered where the person I was searching for had gone. But in the end, I did not meet her. I met a man who had traveled with her. One thing he told me changed my entire journey," he said. The young man asked with interest, "What did he tell you?" The elderly man smiled and replied, "He said that the person we are searching for may not always be where we expect." After a while, the train stopped at a small station. Several passengers stepped off, while a few new passengers entered the carriage. Among them was a middle-aged woman who took the empty seat beside the young man. She carried an old travel bag in her hands. The elderly man greeted her warmly. After they exchanged a few words, she mentioned that she had been traveling on this railway line for many years. The young man quietly listened, feeling that another story was about to become part of his journey. The middle-aged woman placed her travel bag beneath the seat and looked toward the window. "I have traveled along this railway line for many years," she said. The elderly man smiled and replied, "Then you must know many stories from this train." She thought for a moment. "There are many stories. But there is one passenger whose story I still remember," she said. The young man looked toward her. She continued, "That person was also traveling on this same train, searching for someone." She began her story. "Many years ago, a young man traveled along this same railway line every day. He always sat beside the window. One day, he met a young woman. They spoke only during a few journeys. But then, the woman suddenly disappeared." The young man listened carefully. One part of her story caught his attention. After she disappeared, that young man also boarded this same train to search for someone. As she continued her story, he suddenly looked down at the railway ticket in his hand. She had just said that the young man had also traveled along this same railway line searching for someone. "Did he ever find the woman?" he asked. She did not answer immediately. After a moment, she said, "I do not know whether he found her. But I still remember the name of the last station he traveled to." He leaned forward, waiting to hear the name. As the train approached a small station, the middle-aged woman looked through the window. "This is the station," she said quietly. The young man immediately stood and moved closer to the window. An old station sign outside showed the name of the place. It was not the name of the village written on his address. But she told him that the route to that village began from this very station. As the train stopped, he picked up his travel bag. For the first time, his journey seemed to have a clear direction. As soon as he stepped onto the platform, he looked around. The station was almost empty. He approached an elderly railway worker and asked how to reach the village written on his address. The man studied the paper for a moment. "There is no direct road to that village from here. You will need to take a small carriage from this station," he said. The young man adjusted his travel bag. Before the train began moving again, he realized that another part of his journey was about to begin. He walked toward the waiting horse-drawn carriage. The driver looked at the address and said, "The road will not be easy, but we can reach the village before evening." The young man climbed into the carriage. Behind him, the train slowly began moving and left the station. He looked back as it disappeared down the tracks. For a moment, it felt as if the world he knew had been left behind. Now he had only an old book, an address, a railway ticket, and many unanswered questions about Margaret. After the carriage had traveled some distance from the station, the driver suddenly slowed the horse. He pointed toward a small wooden sign beside the road. "The road divides here," he said. "If we go left, we will reach another town. If we go right, there is an old road leading toward the village you are looking for." The young man took out the address paper and looked at the sign. He chose the road on the right. He still had no idea why that road would become important. The carriage turned onto the road to the right. After traveling some distance, they passed a small old house beside the road. An elderly man was sitting outside. As soon as he saw the carriage, he stood up. "Where are you headed?" he asked. When the driver mentioned the name of the village, the old man's expression suddenly changed. He looked directly at the young man and asked, "Why are you going there?" Before the young man could answer, the old man added, "Before you go any farther, you need to tell me where you got that book." The young man held the book in his hand and looked at the elderly man. The moment the old man saw the book, a look of sudden surprise appeared on his face. He slowly stepped closer and carefully examined the book. "How did this book come into your possession?" he asked. The young man told him about Margaret, their meeting on the train, and the address she had given him. After listening to everything, the elderly man remained silent for a moment and said, "Then, she has finally sent you onto this road." After examining the book for a few moments, the elderly man slowly ran his fingers across its back. A small symbol was carved into the cover. The moment he saw it, his expression changed. "Do you know where this symbol came from?" he asked. The young man shook his head. "No," the elderly man handed the book back to him and said, "I saw a book with this same symbol only once, many years ago. I knew who had it back then. But that person is no longer alive." The young man looked carefully at the symbol again. "Who was that person?" he asked. The elderly man did not answer immediately. He walked toward his house and said, "This is not something we should discuss beside the road. Come inside. There is something I need to tell you about that book." The young man thought for a moment and picked up his travel bag. From the old man's words, he felt that something hidden for many years was finally about to be revealed. The elderly man opened the door and walked inside. The young man followed him into the house. In the small room, there was an old wooden cabinet, several books, and a few faded photographs hanging on the wall. The elderly man stopped in front of one photograph. It showed a young man standing beside a young woman. Pointing at the photograph, the old man said, "This is the man I was talking about." The young man looked closely at the picture and suddenly became silent. There was something about the young woman's face that reminded him of Margaret. The young man studied the photograph closely. "Who is this woman?" he asked. The elderly man remained silent for a moment. "Her name was Elizabeth. But the story I know about her is not a short one," he said. The young man beside her was my younger brother. One day, the two of them left this area together. My brother never returned. But several years later, Elizabeth came back alone. The young man immediately asked, "Where did she go?" Instead of answering, the elderly man slowly walked toward the old wooden cabinet. The elderly man walked to the old wooden cabinet and opened a small drawer near the bottom. From inside, he took out an envelope wrapped in an old piece of cloth. He placed it on the table and slowly opened it. Inside was an old handwritten letter. The young man stepped closer and looked at it. The elderly man turned the letter toward him and said, "After Elizabeth returned, she left this letter for my brother." But by then, he had already disappeared. The young man read the first line of the letter and suddenly stopped. The young man read the first line of the letter again. It said, "By the time you read this letter, I may have already returned to that house." The young man immediately looked at the elderly man. "Which house?" he asked. Instead of answering, the elderly man took the letter and opened the final page. There was the name of a village, along with a small drawing of an old house. The name of the village was exactly the same as the name written on the address in the young man's hand. The young man placed the two papers side by side. The same village name appeared on both of them. His hands trembled slightly. Then, "Is this the village Margaret went to?" he asked. The elderly man slowly nodded. "It is possible. But there is one more thing we need to find out," he said. Pointing to the small drawing of the house on the letter, he continued, "That house is in the same village. My brother and Elizabeth went there the last time anyone saw them. After that, no one ever spoke about the house again." The young man immediately picked up his travel bag. After they stepped outside the house, the elderly man stopped the young man. "Wait a moment," he said. He reached into his pocket and placed a small old key into the young man's hand. "This key belongs to that house. I have kept it ever since my brother disappeared. No one has used it for all these years." The young man stared at the key in surprise. "Do you think it will still open the door?" he asked. The elderly man slowly replied, "I don't know if it will, but perhaps it is time to find out what has been waiting behind that door." The young man carefully placed the old key in his pocket. After thanking the elderly man, he walked toward the horse-drawn carriage. But before getting inside, he turned around and looked at the house one more time. Through the window, he noticed the old photograph. The face of Elizabeth reminded him of Margaret once again. At the same moment, he remembered the symbol carved into the back of the book in his hand. The symbol, the photograph, and the village suddenly seemed to be pieces of the same story. For the first time, he felt that everything was connected. The horse-drawn carriage began moving again. After some time, the road gradually became narrower. Tall trees and dense bushes appeared on both sides. The driver looked ahead and said, "The old forest road begins here. We may not meet anyone else until we reach the village." The young man opened the book in his hand and looked through it once more. Near the last few pages, he noticed a small fold he had never seen before. He was about to carefully open the page when the driver suddenly stopped the carriage. The young man leaned forward to see why the driver had stopped. A large tree branch had fallen across the road. The driver climbed down and began moving it aside. At the same time, the young man's attention was drawn to the mud beside the road. Along with the marks left by the carriage wheels, he noticed a set of very old footprints. They disappeared in the direction of the forest. The young man closed the book and carefully studied the footprints. Somehow, it felt as though someone had recently walked through that forest. After the driver moved the branch completely out of the way, the young man walked toward the footprints in the mud. They did not look very old. The marks appeared to belong to the same person. He followed them a few steps into the forest. There, a small piece of white cloth was caught on a tree branch. He carefully removed it. On the cloth was a small symbol, the exact same symbol carved into the back of his book. The young man compared the symbol on the back of the book with the symbol embroidered on the white cloth. They were exactly the same. He realized that the symbol must somehow be connected to the book Margaret had given him. At that moment, a very faint sound came from deeper inside the forest. It sounded like someone walking across dry leaves. The young man immediately turned around. Between the trees, he thought he saw the shadow of a person moving. He took 2 steps toward it, but the shadow suddenly disappeared. The young man slowly walked in the direction where the shadow had disappeared. After a few steps, he noticed a small stone wall hidden between the trees. Beside it stood an old iron gate. The moment he saw the symbol carved into the gate, he stopped. It was the same symbol found on the back of the book. He took the old key given to him by the elderly man from his pocket and stepped closer to the gate to see if it would fit. Standing before a gate that seemed untouched for many years, his heart began to beat faster. The young man placed the old key into the lock of the iron gate. At first, it would not move. When he tried again, the lock slowly turned, breaking years of silence. The iron gate opened with a quiet creak. Beyond it, hidden among the dense trees, stood an old stone house. The same symbol was carved above its doorway. The young man looked at the book in his hand, then back at the house. For the first time, he felt that the answer to the reason behind his journey might be waiting inside. The young man slowly walked toward the stone house. He compared the symbol above the door with the symbol carved into the back of his book. They were identical. He placed the old key into the lock. This time, it turned easily. When the door opened, he saw a silent room that looked as though no one had lived there for many years. But one object on the table immediately caught his attention. It was an old photograph. The moment he saw the person in the photograph, the young man stood completely still. The young man walked toward the table and picked up the photograph. As he looked at it closely, surprise appeared in his eyes. The person in the photograph was none other than the elderly man, but much younger. Elizabeth was standing beside him. The young man turned the photograph over and looked at the back. There was a date written there, followed by a short sentence. The moment he read those words, the surprise on his face grew even stronger. The young man read the sentence on the back of the photograph again. It said, "If you trust her, you will never find him." The words left him even more confused. Who was Elizabeth talking about? And why had she written this warning? He placed the photograph back on the table and slowly looked around the room. That was when he noticed an old wooden chest leaning against the wall. The same symbol was carved into its lid. The young man walked toward the old wooden chest and gently touched the symbol carved into its lid. It was exactly the same as the symbol on the back of the book. He carefully examined the chest. Although it had an old lock, there was surprisingly little rust on it. That meant the chest might have been opened by someone at some point, even though it had been closed for many years. The young man took the old key from his pocket. He examined the lock to see if the key would fit, then slowly inserted it. The young man slowly turned the key. This time, the lock opened with a quiet click. He paused for a moment before carefully lifting the lid of the chest. Inside were old letters, several photographs, and a small leather diary. Beneath them, he noticed a small wooden box. There was no lock on it. But when he saw the symbol carved into its lid, he was stunned. It was the exact same symbol found on his book. The young man picked up the small wooden box. It felt surprisingly light in his hands. Just as he was about to open it, the old leather diary slipped from the chest and fell onto the floor. The diary opened to a particular page, and the name Margaret was clearly visible. The young man suddenly froze. How did Margaret come here? He whispered to himself. He picked up the diary and began reading the page carefully. The young man carefully read the page in the diary. It said, "Today, Margaret came here. When I saw the book in her hands, I knew the moment I had been waiting for all these years had finally arrived." The young man stared at the words in disbelief. He had never known that Margaret had come to this house. And the diary even mentioned the book she was carrying. He immediately looked down at the book in his own hands. While reading the diary, he noticed another sentence. It said, "She placed the book in his hands and told him not to trust anyone until it reached the right person." He read the sentence again. He suddenly remembered the moment Margaret had placed the same book in his hands. But who was the he mentioned in the diary? He turned the page. On the next page, he found a name. The moment he saw it, his expression changed. He stared at the name in the diary for a long moment without saying a word. It was not completely unfamiliar. He had heard that name once since the beginning of his journey. But seeing it written here, in a diary from so many years ago, was almost impossible to believe. He examined the page again. Beneath the name was a date. The moment he saw it, he remembered the old key in his pocket. The day that key had come into his hands was surprisingly close to the date written in the diary. He immediately looked at the date in the diary again. Then he took the old key from his pocket. As he examined it in his hand, he noticed tiny letters engraved on the back of the key. He had never noticed them before. Comparing them with the date in the diary, he realized that the letters were the initials of the same person's name. At that exact moment, a strong gust of wind swept through the house, and the front door suddenly slammed shut. The sound of the door closing echoed through the room. He stood still for a few moments, then slowly walked toward it. Near the doorway, he noticed a small piece of paper on the floor. It seemed to have been carried inside by the wind. He picked it up and unfolded it. There was only one sentence written on it: "If you have reached this house, the book has finally found the right person." After reading the words, he held the book tightly in his hands. Holding the paper, he returned to the diary. As he quickly turned through the final pages, he discovered a small envelope. Margaret's name was written on it. When he opened the envelope, there was only one photograph inside. The moment he saw it, he stopped breathing for a second. Margaret was standing beside Elizabeth. But behind them was a house he recognized immediately. It was the very same house he was standing in now. He stood silently for a few moments, staring at the photograph. One thing was now clear. Margaret had not come to this house by accident. She had deliberately brought the book here. But why? He placed the photograph beside the diary and picked up the small wooden box again. Looking at the symbol carved into its lid, he finally decided to open it. His fingers slowly lifted the lid. The lid opened completely. Inside were a small silver locket, several old letters, and a folded piece of paper. He picked up the locket first. When he opened it, he found a tiny photograph of Margaret inside. On the back of the photograph was a short message: if you ever reach this house, open this locket to learn the truth." He read the words and quietly closed his eyes. At last, he understood that the answer Margaret had left for him was now in his own hands. Holding the book tightly, he walked toward the second door. When he opened it, he found a small room with an old wooden chair and a table beside it. Another letter was waiting on the table. As he opened it and began reading, he finally understood why Margaret had sent him on this journey. "If you have reached this place carrying the book, then you have discovered the truth I could never tell you. I trusted you, and that is why I left this path for you." His eyes filled with tears. He folded the letter and placed it safely in his pocket. As he looked at the book in his hands, he realized that this journey had not only led him to a mystery, but had also shown him the meaning of the trust Margaret had placed in him. He stepped outside and looked back at the old house one final time. Morning light was slowly appearing between the trees. Holding the book close to his chest, he began walking back along the forest path. Behind him remained an old forgotten house, but he carried Margaret's truth with him. From that day forward, his life would never be the same. Until we meet again with another beautiful story, this is your SR. Good night, my friends. Sleep well, sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next story.